The war in Ukraine entered another critical phase in late November 2025, as Russian President Vladimir Putin issued a new, stark warning to Ukraine. In a statement delivered during his visit to Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan, Putin underscored the high stakes of the ongoing conflict, making clear that Russia would not back down from its territorial demands, while also offering a possible pathway to peace, under one crucial condition. On November 27, 2025, Putin made clear that any potential peace agreement would hinge on Ukraine's willingness to give up control of certain regions, some of which have been contested or occupied by Russian forces since 2014, while others were taken during the more recent 2022 invasion. Putin stated that Russia would only cease its military operations if Ukraine agreed to withdraw its forces from what Russia considers its own territories. If Ukrainian troops leave the territories they hold, then we will stop combat operations, he declared. If they don't, then we will achieve this by military means. Putin's remarks marked a significant escalation in the rhetoric surrounding the conflict, highlighting the intransigence of the Russian side. Moscow's claims over Ukrainian territories include regions like Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea, and the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. The Russian president's ultimatum seems to leave little room for compromise. This development adds further weight to concerns that the war will not only continue, but could intensify if Ukraine refuses to yield its territorial sovereignty. As Putin framed his ultimatum, he also acknowledged the recent diplomatic efforts led by the United States to facilitate peace talks. According to Russian sources, Washington has proposed a revised peace plan, drafted by US officials, that could form the basis of any future agreement. Putin's acceptance of the US-drafted text, while setting firm conditions, suggests a potential opening for negotiations. However, that opening appears contingent on Ukraine's withdrawal from the territories Russia now controls. Putin noted that the US proposed text, which includes stipulations for mutual de-escalation and territorial adjustments, could serve as the framework for future peace talks. But his remarks were laced with conditions. If Ukraine does not comply with Russia's territorial demands, any peace process would be effectively halted. We see that the American side takes our position into account in some areas, he said, indicating that some elements of the proposal aligned with Russia's demands. However, he reaffirmed that Moscow's fundamental expectations, specifically regarding territorial control, would not be negotiable. According to pro-Ukrainian mapping estimates, Russia now controls roughly 19% of Ukrainian territory, which includes substantial regions like Donetsk, Luhansk, parts of Zaporizhia and Kherson, and Crimea. Despite modest gains in the east, the Russian military's advancement in 2025 has been relatively slow. The front lines remain fluid, with both sides engaging in periodic clashes as they vie for control of strategic areas. The territories in dispute represent a major point of contention in any potential negotiations. Since the early stages of the conflict, Russia has firmly rejected any suggestion of returning occupied territories, labeling them as liberated lands under Moscow's rightful control. Putin's position has remained consistent in demanding that Ukraine cede these areas as part of any ceasefire or future peace deal. This stance contrasts with Ukraine's insistence on regaining all its territories and sovereignty, including Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014. Ukraine's position has remained firm. Ukrainian officials, including President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, have repeatedly stated that the country will not relinquish any part of its sovereign land. The idea of ceding territory to Russia, under any circumstances, has been rejected as unacceptable by Ukraine's leadership. As long as Zelenskyy is president, no one should count on us giving up territory, said Andriy Yermak, Ukraine's chief negotiator, speaking in an interview with The Atlantic. Yermak emphasized that any agreement that requires Ukraine to surrender parts of its land would violate the Ukrainian constitution, which guarantees the inviolability of territorial integrity. He also indicated that such a proposal would be politically untenable, as it would be met with fierce resistance from both the Ukrainian public and the armed forces. Not a single sane person today would sign a document to give up territory, Yermak added, referring to the broader rejection of territorial concessions. Zelensky's government has made clear that it sees any peace deal that involves territorial concessions as a non-starter. Ukrainian officials have expressed their belief that Russia's annexation of Ukrainian land is illegal under international law, and that any peace deal must include full territorial restoration for Ukraine, including Crimea. This position creates a stark deadlock in diplomatic efforts. For Moscow, the recognition of its control over these territories, or at least the cessation of hostilities in these areas, is a non-negotiable condition for peace. For Kyiv, however, any agreement that involves territorial surrender undermines the very basis of Ukraine's sovereignty. The constitutional and political realities within Ukraine make it nearly impossible for Zelensky to entertain any agreement that would cede territory. This has led to increasing tensions not only between Kyiv and Moscow, but also between Kyiv and potential mediators, including the United States and European powers, which have sought to balance both parties' demands. While the United States and its allies have reiterated support for Ukraine's sovereignty, the pressure is mounting for Ukraine to find a way to end the conflict. US officials, including President Joe Biden, have consistently stated that Ukraine must be given the agency to determine its own future and territorial boundaries. However, behind closed doors, there are growing concerns about the prolonged nature of the war and the broader economic and humanitarian costs involved. Some Western leaders have begun to voice concerns about the sustainability of indefinite support for Ukraine. Biden's administration has also been involved in facilitating talks with Russian officials, with Special Envoy Steve Witkoff expected to visit Moscow in early December to continue diplomatic outreach. US and European officials have suggested that some compromise might be needed to bring about a ceasefire. However, there remains a significant gap between the two sides' demands, especially on the issue of territorial integrity. As diplomatic negotiations continue, the military situation on the ground remains fluid. Russian forces continue to hold ground in key areas, particularly in the east and south. In recent months, Moscow has made incremental progress, capturing villages in the Donbas region and securing defensive positions. However, Ukrainian forces have mounted several successful counterattacks, particularly in the south, regaining territory along the Black Sea coast. Ukraine's military leadership has stressed the importance of maintaining pressure on Russian forces, while also preparing for potential Russian reinforcements, particularly in the event of an escalation in tensions. The ongoing battles for cities like Bakhmut and Mariupol remain a focal point, with both sides committing significant resources to the conflict. Ukraine's armed forces are determined to push back Russian forces, but the cost of such operations has been high, with thousands of casualties reported on both sides. The conflict in Ukraine continues to resonate beyond the region, influencing global politics. The war has significantly strained relations between Russia and the West, with sanctions on Russia continuing to bite. Russia's economy, already struggling under the weight of Western sanctions, has faced additional pressures as the war drags on. Russia's relationship with China remains a key aspect of its strategy. While China has refrained from direct involvement in the conflict, Beijing has been careful to maintain a delicate balance between its support for Russia and its broader geopolitical interests. Moscow has also been seeking to deepen ties with other non-Western powers, including Iran and various Central Asian states, as it faces mounting pressure from the West. In Europe, NATO has reaffirmed its support for Ukraine, but there are growing concerns about the potential for the war to escalate further. NATO members have been discussing contingency plans in case of a wider confrontation, particularly in light of Putin's repeated threats to use nuclear weapons in the event of a direct clash with NATO forces. NATO has made it clear that it will defend its members, but it has also been working to avoid direct confrontation with Russia. As winter sets in and the conflict enters its fourth year, the possibility of a negotiated peace remains uncertain. Both sides have dug in their positions, and the gap between their demands seems as wide as ever. Russia insists on territorial concessions as a precondition for peace, while Ukraine maintains that it will not give up any land. the international community remains divided, with some advocating for a swift settlement to avoid further destruction and loss of life, while others believe that Ukraine must be given the time and space to regain its territories. As the war continues, the pressure will likely intensify on both sides to come to a resolution. But for now, the war shows no signs of abating, and the prospects for peace remain distant. The war in Ukraine continues, with no clear end in sight. Russia's demands for territorial concessions from Ukraine remain a major obstacle to peace, while Ukraine's refusal to cede any land undercuts Moscow's expectations. Diplomatic efforts continue, but the path to a lasting peace seems elusive, with both sides remaining entrenched in their positions. The military situation remains tense, and the global community watches closely as the future of Ukraine and the broader region hangs in the balance.